There is a strange thing about procrastination. You can spend 3 hours doing absolutely nothing important, and somehow feel exhausted afterward. You can watch videos, check your phone, open the same app 5 times, clean something that didn't need cleaning, rearrange your files, make a new plan, watch another productivity video. And all the while, there is one thing sitting quietly in the background. The thing you said you would do. The application. The assignment. The workout. The business idea. The phone call. The difficult conversation. The book you keep saying you'll write. The life you keep saying you're going to build. And you know you should start. That's the part that makes procrastination so confusing. Because if you genuinely didn't care, it would make sense. But you do care. Sometimes you care deeply. So why do you keep avoiding it? Maybe you're lazy. That's the explanation you've probably given yourself. But there is another possibility. Maybe you're not avoiding the task. Maybe you're avoiding the feeling attached to the task. And once you understand that distinction, the entire problem starts to look different. Imagine someone sitting at a desk. The laptop is open. The document is empty. They have everything they need. No one is stopping them. They even have enough time. But they don't begin. Instead, they reach for their phone. 5 minutes. Then 20. Then an hour. Eventually, guilt arrives. Now they feel worse. And because they feel worse, starting feels even harder. So they escape again. Another video. Another scroll. Another distraction. And for a few moments, something changes. The pressure disappears. Not permanently. Just long enough to breathe. That tiny moment of relief is important. Because it tells us something about procrastination that the word lazy completely misses. The behavior may be doing a job. It is reducing discomfort. Fuchsia Serwa and Timothy Pitchell have argued that procrastination can function as short-term mood repair. When a task feels aversive, delaying it can make the person feel better immediately, even though the consequences are pushed onto their future self. And that creates a brutal trade. Your present self gets relief. Your future self gets the bill. This explains one of the strangest features of procrastination. You don't necessarily choose the thing that is best for you. You choose the thing that feels better right now. The deadline is next month. The phone feels good now. The exam is next week. The video feels good now. The business could change your life. But sending the first email might expose you to rejection now. So suddenly checking your phone becomes incredibly attractive. This isn't because the phone has magically become more valuable. It's because the emotional distance between the discomfort and the reward has changed the calculation. Research on procrastination has repeatedly found that task aversiveness, delay, self-efficacy and impulsiveness are important factors. And longitudinal research examining procrastination across goal stages found that people become particularly vulnerable when temptations are nearby and the intended action is psychologically distant. In other words, the human mind has a problem. It is very good at understanding what matters eventually. It is much less reliable at sacrificing comfort for something that matters later. And that is where the story gets deeper. Because sometimes the discomfort isn't caused by the task itself. The task is only the doorway. Think about something you have been postponing. Don't choose something trivial. Choose something that actually matters. Something you've been saying you'll do for weeks or months. Now ask yourself, what would happen if I actually started? Not theoretically. Emotionally. What would you have to face? Maybe you could fail. Maybe someone could judge you. Maybe you would discover you're not as good as you hoped. Maybe you would have to commit. Maybe you would have to stop telling yourself you're going to do it someday and finally find out whether you can. Maybe the moment you start, the fantasy becomes reality. And reality can be frightening. Because as long as the dream remains unfinished, it is still perfect. You can imagine yourself becoming successful. You can imagine the business working. You can imagine writing the book. You can imagine changing your body. You can imagine becoming disciplined. But the moment you begin, reality gets involved. Reality can reject you. Reality can expose weaknesses. Reality can produce results that are smaller than the fantasy. And suddenly, doing nothing protects something. It protects the possibility that you could have succeeded. This is one reason perfectionism can become tangled with procrastination. Not all perfectionism works the same way. Research distinguishes between different dimensions of perfectionism. Perfectionistic concerns, worrying about mistakes, evaluation, and not meeting standards. have been positively associated with procrastination. While perfectionistic strivings can show a different relationship, that distinction matters. Because someone can look ambitious from the outside, while secretly being terrified of producing something imperfect. So they wait. They research. They plan. They optimize. They buy another notebook. They watch another tutorial. They tell themselves, I just need the right system. But sometimes the system isn't the problem. Starting is. Because starting creates evidence. And evidence can threaten the story you have about yourself. If you never publish the video, you can still imagine you're a future filmmaker. If you never launch the business, you can still imagine you're an entrepreneur. If you never apply, you can still imagine you might have gotten the job. If you never ask, you never have to hear no. Avoidance protects possibility. But it also destroys progress. And that is the contradiction. You might think procrastination is about avoiding failure. Sometimes it is. But sometimes people also avoid success. Because success creates obligations. If you succeed, people may expect more from you. If you become good at something, you may have to keep doing it. If your business works, you have customers to serve. If your work gets noticed, you become visible. If you change your life, people around you may notice that you've changed. Success isn't simply a reward. It can also be a new set of responsibilities. So the unconscious question isn't always, what if I fail? Sometimes it is, what happens if this actually works? And that question can be surprisingly uncomfortable. But we need to be careful here. This is where psychology content often goes wrong. It is tempting to turn every behavior into a hidden trauma. To say, you're not lazy. You're traumatized. Or, you're procrastinating because you're afraid of success. Or, your nervous system is protecting you. Those explanations can sound profound. But human behavior is rarely that simple. Procrastination has multiple causes. Sometimes the task is boring. Sometimes the reward is too distant. Sometimes you don't know how to begin. Sometimes your confidence is low. Sometimes you are surrounded by distractions. Sometimes you genuinely don't care enough. Sometimes you're tired. And sometimes there really is an emotional thread attached to the task. The research does not justify reducing all procrastination to one hidden psychological wound. A 2026 systematic review of academic procrastination, for example, describes it as a multidimensional problem involving factors such as fear of failure, perfectionism, emotional regulation, motivation and self-regulation. That is a much more useful way to think. Not, there is one secret reason I procrastinate. But, there may be several forces competing inside this moment. And now we can ask a much better question. What exactly happens in the few seconds before you avoid something? Because that's where the pattern lives. Not afterward. Not in the guilt. Not in the motivational speech you give yourself at midnight. The important moment is earlier. You open the document. You see the blank page. And something happens. Maybe boredom. Maybe uncertainty. Maybe self-doubt. Maybe the thought, I don't know how to do this. Maybe. What if it's terrible? Maybe. I have so much to do. Maybe simply, I don't feel like it. Then comes the escape. And the escape works. For a moment. The discomfort drops. That's why avoidance can become self-reinforcing. You don't need to consciously decide, I am going to train myself to procrastinate. You simply discover, through repetition, that avoidance changes how you feel. The brain learns from consequences. If avoiding something repeatedly produces immediate relief, avoidance becomes easier to repeat. And now the problem is no longer simply the task. The problem is the relationship between the task and the emotion. This is where shame enters. You procrastinate. Then you insult yourself. I'm useless. I'm so lazy. Why can't I just be normal? Everyone else can do this. And you imagine that harshness will finally force you to change. Sometimes it does for a moment. But often it creates another layer of discomfort. Now the task doesn't just represent work. It represents evidence against your identity. You don't sit down to write. You sit down to confront the possibility that you're the person who never follows through. So you avoid again. Research has found links between shame, rumination, and procrastination. With one study finding that brooding and reflective rumination helped explain the relationship between shame and procrastination in a collegiate sample. And that creates a vicious circle. Avoidance creates guilt. Guilt creates shame. Shame makes the task emotionally heavier. The heavier the task feels, the more attractive escape becomes. So you escape. And the cycle begins again. Notice what has happened. At the beginning, you thought the problem was, I don't work hard enough. Now the problem looks different. It may be, certain tasks trigger emotions I have learned to escape. That is a much more precise problem. Because you can work with it. Suppose you are avoiding an important application. Instead of asking, why am I lazy? Ask, what am I afraid this application might tell me about myself? Maybe the answer is rejection. Now you know what you're dealing with. Or suppose you're avoiding the gym. Ask, what makes starting uncomfortable? Maybe it's not exercise. Maybe it's embarrassment. Maybe you feel uncomfortable being seen as a beginner. Or suppose you're avoiding your business. Ask, what would making this real force me to confront? Maybe uncertainty. Maybe financial risk. Maybe the possibility that your idea isn't as good as you believe. The point isn't to invent a dramatic explanation. The point is to investigate. Because there is something almost paradoxical about avoidance. The thing you avoid becomes more powerful. The unread email becomes heavier. The unfinished assignment becomes scarier. The phone call becomes more difficult. The project becomes enormous. The longer you stay away from something, the more psychological weight it can acquire. And this is why waiting to feel ready can be such a dangerous strategy. You expect discomfort to disappear before you act. But sometimes action is what teaches your brain that the discomfort is survivable. Not every task needs courage. But some meaningful tasks require you to tolerate a small amount of discomfort before motivation catches up. That is very different from forcing yourself through everything. It means learning to distinguish. This is difficult. From, I must escape this feeling. Those are not the same statement. And now we reach one of the most important distinctions in the entire story. You don't need to become someone who never procrastinates. That's unrealistic. The goal is to become better at noticing the moment when avoidance begins. Because there is a difference between rest and avoidance. If you've worked for 6 hours and your mind needs a break, resting isn't laziness. If you're sick, sleeping isn't procrastination. If you're genuinely exhausted, recovering isn't weakness. But if you repeatedly tell yourself you're resting, while secretly using the break to avoid something that matters, then the question changes. What are you resting from? Sometimes the answer is physical fatigue. Sometimes it's mental overload. Sometimes it's emotional discomfort. And sometimes, it's yourself. There is another reason this matters. Procrastination doesn't only steal time. It changes your relationship with your future. Every time you postpone something important, you make a small transaction. You say, future me can handle this. Future you will work. Future you will exercise. Future you will apologize. Future you will start the business. Future you will finally become disciplined. Future you becomes the person responsible for everything present you doesn't want to feel. And future you is always somewhere else. Tomorrow. Monday. Next month. After the holidays. After you get more money. After you feel confident. After you learn enough. After life becomes less complicated. But eventually, you discover something uncomfortable. There is no version of your life called later. There is only the present moment repeatedly becoming the past. Serwa and Pitchell's work emphasizes this tension between present mood repair and the consequences imposed on the future self. And that may be the hidden tragedy of chronic procrastination. You're not only delaying a task. You are repeatedly asking a future version of yourself to live with the consequences of a present decision. And yet, there is a strange mercy in understanding this. Because if you have spent years calling yourself lazy, you may have been trying to solve the wrong problem. You tried motivation. You tried discipline. You tried waking up at 5. You tried deleting social media. You tried making schedules. You tried promising yourself that tomorrow would be different. Some of those things may help. But if the task itself triggers fear, shame, uncertainty or overwhelm, another productivity system may not solve the underlying friction. You have to become curious about the friction. Not obsessed with it. Curious. Imagine you have to send an important message. Instead of spending an hour fighting yourself, pause. What am I feeling? What am I predicting? What am I afraid will happen? What am I making this mean about me? And then make the action smaller. Not, send the perfect message. Just, open the message. Not, build the company. Just, write the first sentence. Not, transform my life. Just, do the first uncomfortable thing. This isn't because tiny actions magically cure procrastination. They don't. It's because reducing the psychological size of the first step can make it easier to cross the boundary between intention and action. And that boundary is where procrastination often lives. Longitudinal research has specifically examined the gap between intending to act and actually acting, finding that procrastination is strongly related to that intention-action gap. You don't necessarily need a new personality. Sometimes you need a smaller doorway. But there is an even deeper lesson. The more important the goal becomes to your identity, the more emotionally loaded it can become. If you tell yourself, "I want to write a book," the task is difficult, but if you tell yourself, "If I write this book, I will finally prove that I am talented," the task becomes psychologically dangerous. Now every sentence is a referendum on your worth. One bad paragraph isn't just a bad paragraph. It feels like evidence. One rejection isn't just rejection. It feels like confirmation. And suddenly procrastination becomes attractive. Because not trying protects your self-image. This is why sometimes the person who cares the most about succeeding can become the person most afraid to begin. The stakes have become too personal. And perhaps that's why the question, "Why am I so lazy?" can be such a destructive question. Because it turns a behavior into a character judgment. It closes the investigation before it begins. You're lazy. Case closed. But imagine asking, "What happens immediately before I avoid?" Now you're investigating a pattern. And patterns can change. Maybe you discover that you avoid tasks when the instructions are unclear. Then the solution is clarity. Maybe you avoid when the reward is too distant. Then the solution may involve changing the environment or making progress more visible. Maybe you avoid because you're overwhelmed. Then the task needs to be broken down. Maybe you're exhausted. Then the answer isn't another productivity trick. Maybe you fear judgment. Then the real work involves learning to tolerate evaluation. Maybe you expect perfection. Then you need to separate beginning from performing perfectly. Maybe you genuinely don't want the goal. And that is an important discovery too. Because sometimes procrastination isn't a failure of discipline. Sometimes it is information. You're spending enormous energy trying to force yourself toward a life you don't actually want. That possibility can be uncomfortable. Because sometimes we say we want something because it sounds impressive. We want the successful career, the perfect body, the business, the degree, the relationship, the lifestyle. But when it comes time to do the ordinary, repetitive, unglamorous work required to get there, we disappear. And perhaps the problem isn't that we lack motivation. Perhaps the fantasy was more attractive than the reality. That's not something to feel ashamed of. It's something to understand. Because a goal you genuinely value should eventually survive contact with ordinary effort. Now think back to the beginning. The person sitting at the desk. The blank document. The phone beside them. At first, it looked like laziness. But now you know there could be several stories underneath that moment. Maybe they are afraid. Maybe they are overwhelmed. Maybe they don't know where to start. Maybe the reward is too far away. Maybe they are exhausted. Maybe they don't actually care about the goal. Maybe they have trained themselves to seek immediate relief whenever discomfort appears. And perhaps that's the most important insight. You don't have to decide which explanation is true from the outside. You have to observe your own pattern. Because the same behavior can come from completely different causes. Two people can both spend 3 hours scrolling. One may be exhausted. One may be avoiding failure. One may be bored. One may hate the work. One may be overwhelmed. One may simply be distracted. The behavior is identical. The psychology isn't. So the next time you catch yourself avoiding something important, don't immediately reach for self-hatred. Pause. And ask 4 questions. What am I avoiding? Then, what feeling appears when I move toward it? Then, what am I predicting will happen if I actually do it? And finally, what is the smallest honest action I can take without waiting to feel completely ready? The answers may surprise you. Maybe you'll discover fear. Maybe uncertainty. Maybe perfectionism. Maybe resentment. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe nothing profound at all. Maybe you simply need to put the phone in another room and start. That's okay too. The purpose of psychological insight isn't to make ordinary problems sound mysterious. It's to make the problem more precise. Because there is one final trap. Once you learn that procrastination can be emotional avoidance, you can procrastinate by analyzing your procrastination. You can spend 3 hours researching your childhood. You can watch 20 videos about avoidance. You can learn every psychological term. You can understand the entire mechanism. And still not send the email. Insight is not the same as change. Understanding the pattern matters. But eventually, you have to approach the thing you've been avoiding. That is where the real transformation happens. Not when the fear disappears. Not when motivation suddenly arrives. Not when you become a perfectly disciplined person. But when you feel the discomfort. And don't immediately obey it. Maybe your hands still feel heavy. Maybe you're still uncertain. Maybe you still wonder whether you'll fail. But you begin anyway. One sentence. One application. One conversation. One workout. One uncomfortable decision. One honest admission. One small action that tells your brain, I can feel this and still move. That may be a much more important skill than motivation. Because motivation asks, do I feel like doing this? Maturity asks, is this worth doing even though I don't feel like it? And psychological freedom asks something deeper, can I allow an uncomfortable feeling to exist without immediately trying to escape it? That is the skill underneath the skill. So maybe you're not lazy. But don't turn that sentence into another excuse. You may be avoiding something. You may be overwhelmed. You may be afraid. You may be distracted. You may be exhausted. You may be pursuing a goal that isn't really yours. Or you may simply have built habits that make immediate comfort easier than delayed reward. The important thing is to stop treating all of those possibilities as one word, lazy. Because lazy tells you almost nothing. It doesn't tell you what to change. It doesn't tell you what you're afraid of. It doesn't tell you what environment is working against you. It doesn't tell you whether you're tired. It doesn't tell you whether the goal matters. It doesn't tell you what happens in the moment before you escape. It only tells you how you feel about yourself. And shame is a terrible diagnostic tool. The next time you find yourself staring at something important and reaching for your phone, don't ask, what's wrong with me? Ask, what am I trying not to feel right now? Maybe the answer is uncomfortable. Good. Now you have something real to work with. Because the goal isn't to become someone who never feels fear. It isn't to eliminate boredom. It isn't to become endlessly productive. It isn't to turn your life into one giant optimization project. The goal is simpler. To become someone who can remain present when the mind offers escape. Someone who can feel uncertainty without immediately needing certainty. Someone who can experience imperfection without abandoning the attempt. Someone who can fail without turning failure into an identity. Someone who can rest without hiding. Someone who can choose tomorrow's life without constantly sacrificing it to today's comfort. And perhaps that is the difference between being trapped in avoidance and beginning to live deliberately. Because sometimes the thing standing between you and the life you want isn't a lack of discipline. Sometimes it's a feeling you spent years learning how to escape. And the moment you stop asking, why am I so lazy? And start asking, what am I avoiding? The problem finally becomes visible. And what becomes visible can finally be faced.